gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India, and we are at the Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. We are delighted to introduce how can one person help save the world. This session is presented by Hero Future Energies and is part of the Urgency of Borrowed Time series. Simon Mundy, Financial Times journalist and author of Race for Tomorrow, Survival, Innovation and Profit on the front lines of the climate crisis, speaks on the question of what impact a single person can have in the face of the global climate crisis. His talk features stories of inspiring individuals from every region of the world, as well as considering the role that each and every one of us can play. Simon is the moral money editor of the Financial Times, covering the push for a cleaner and more sustainable world economy for the award-winning Moral Money platform and across the wider FT. Mundy is the author of Race for Tomorrow, a book on the global scramble to respond to climate change. Before I invite Simon on stage, we'd like to play a video which features Simon's work, which has been shot on his journey. Can we have the video, please? And Simon, please come on stage as well.
Greatest race in human history. With the tilt balance of international power, it would be a fortune to colossal scale, and destroy it too. It would upend communities of all civilizations in every part of the planet, and push some of them into the fight for survival. It's already begun. Join me on a journey for a changing planet, meeting the people in the front lines of the climate crisis, and changes that extend cascading through the world. From indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon, battling against the destruction of their rainforest by illegal cattle farming, to the startup venture in Iceland, with sucking carbon dioxide from the air and turning it into underground stone. We'll see how rising oceans are devastating island villages in the South Pacific, while driving a vast wave of migration from Bangladesh. And how Greenland's vanishing ice is promising an economic boom, even as it threatens the ancient tradition of its ice country. From Guangzhou to Silicon Valley, we'll meet tycoons fighting for pole position in the market for electric cars. And the Congolese miners risking their lives to dig up the minerals for batteries that power them. Across the world, we'll see how climate change is throwing some of the planet's most powerful industries into turmoil, as an army of high-powered startups scrambles to make billions by taking their place. It's a cast of characters from every walk of life, from every corner of the globe, all of them playing their part in the biggest story of the century.
Good afternoon. It is wonderful to be back in India, and especially wonderful to be back in Jaipur, and especially wonderful to be here at the Jaipur Literature Festival, truly the greatest literary show on earth. I spent 3 years in India as the Financial Times' Mumbai correspondent from 2016 to 2019. And it was a really extraordinary time, and I owe India a lot, including a large part of the inspiration for this book, Race for Tomorrow. It was very soon after I arrived in India, in Mumbai, that I took a trip out to an area called Marathwada in Maharashtra state, which had been very, very badly hit by drought. And I wanted to see what was happening there. So I took the overnight train to Latur, and what I found on the ground was very shocking indeed. I visited farmers whose land had been devastated by the lack of rain. I walked the floors of reservoirs with their cracked earth on the floor, total absence of any kind of moisture. And when I spoke to meteorologists and saw the charts that they had produced, it was very clear to me that this was part of a long-term trend. This was the result of climate change. And I had always, up until that point, been interested in climate change like most of us are. But it had always struck me as something of a slow-burning, long-term threat that our grandchildren would have to grapple with. And now, for the first time, I saw that people were really dealing with this, battling it in real time right now. And then later the same year, I had a conversation which further moved my thinking along on this front. I had a conversation with somebody who happened to work in the publishing industry. And she talked about how people tend not to be that interested in books about climate change. And I thought, that's interesting, because there's nothing obvious about this subject that could be considered dull. This is full of the most incredibly compelling drama and human stories. From my point of view as a journalist, it's simply the biggest story out there. It affects politics and business and humanitarian issues, every kind of story you can imagine. But a lot of people feel that it can seem very abstract, very overwhelming, intimidating, politicized. So I had the idea of writing a book that would get on the ground, meet people from all over the world, and simply tell their stories without giving my particular opinion on all of it, but trying to bring to life the extraordinary stories of these people in every part of the world. So that's what I set out to do. I started a journey that ended up taking 2 years through 26 countries on 6 continents. I wasn't expecting a once-in-a-century pandemic to break out halfway through, but I managed to keep the travels going. And I encountered the most extraordinary stories from every part of the world, from Congolese cobalt miners to winemakers in Chile and Siberian mammoth tusk hunters, herders in Mongolia. And I'd like to just share a few of those stories with you today. So my journey began in Siberia, specifically in a place called Yakutia, which is a territory the size of India, actually, with fewer than 1 million people, far up in the northeast of Siberia. This is remote even by Siberian standards. And a huge part of Yakutia, indeed of Siberia as a whole, is permafrost. So this is ground that has been frozen ever since the last ice age. And within that permafrost is the ancient remains of plants and animals, sort of organic matter that's been frozen for thousands and thousands of years. But as the earth thaws with the rising temperatures every summer, that permafrost is thawing out, and that matter is being broken down, much like if you imagine you switch off your freezer for several days, the food inside would start to rot. That's what's happening at a subcontinental scale in Siberia. The permafrost zone of Russia is the size of China plus Afghanistan plus Nigeria all combined. And this photo I took at a place called Batagayka. The Batagayka megaslump is the biggest phenomenon of its kind in the whole world. And it's been growing and growing and growing for decades now. It's now deep enough to swallow the Sydney Opera House. It's about 2 kilometers long. I stood inside it and it sounded like a construction site. I could just hear the sound of earth falling down, blocks of rubble falling down all around. It's growing and growing. And this is just one symptom of something that is happening right across the subpolar regions of the world. But for some people in Siberia, this is actually starting to look like a bit of a bonanza, because within the permafrost are hidden the ancient remains of all sorts of animals, including woolly mammoths, whose ivory is of tremendous interest to various people in China. You can find them finely engraved in casinos in Macau and posh hotels in Hong Kong. So one day I set out on a boat ride. It was a sort of 15-hour journey in a tiny boat through the midnight sun of Siberia. And we came across a camp where some hunters were illegally putting the permafrost into overdrive by pumping away at the earth with hose pipes. And that was where I found that this is a mammoth hip, which the hunters had no interest in because the Chinese had no interest in it. They were after the tusks, and they were finding many thousands and thousands of dollars worth. So from their point of view, this is all a wonderful thing. In fact, one of them said to me, you know, we talk about the gold rush in California. Well, this is the tusk rush. But there's one man who's trying to do something about this in Siberia itself, to try and hold back the thaw of the permafrost. And his name is Sergei Zimov. He's this extraordinarily eccentric character Now, this is right up in the far northeast of Siberia. This is getting towards Alaska, well to the east of Japan on the Arctic coastline. And he's creating something called Pleistocene Park. So obviously, inspired by the name Jurassic Park, the Pleistocene is basically the period when you had all the ice ages. And he wants to turn Siberia back into that period of history to keep the permafrost intact. And he says counterintuitively, the way to do that is to destroy all the forests, because forests are wonderful in tropical regions. The Amazon rainforest, as I'll come to later, is obviously incredibly important. But according to the research produced by people like Zimov, forests are not helpful in the permafrost zones. They're darker, they absorb more heat, they don't protect the permafrost as well as flat grasslands. And for the grasslands, you need animals to trample all over the earth, to keep it flat. And so that's what he's doing. He's trying to populate this area of Siberia with large mammals to prove his concept, so that he hopes one day some wealthy billionaire is going to provide him all the money he needs to fund a massive expansion of this across whole swathes of Siberia. And he's hoping that one day those animals could include a woolly mammoth. George Church, the celebrated geneticist at Harvard University, is trying to engineer a mammoth using the Indian elephant genome. And he's promised that the very first elephant will be sent to Zimov at Pleistocene Park. And Zimov is convinced that people can listen to him or not. It might sound crazy, but he's been studying this stuff for decades. And he says that if we don't listen to him, then the permafrost is going to meet a very sticky end, indeed, with consequences for all of us. Now, it's not just in Siberia, of course, that this melting and thawing is happening. I took this photo at Chorolpa, which is one of the largest glacial lakes in the Nepali Himalaya. So all of this, you see that glacier at the very far end, that thing at the end is a glacier, and that used to cover the whole of this valley, but it's been retreating day after day during the summer. I stood close to it. I could see the blocks of ice loudly falling off and crashing into the lake. And the volume of ice that's melting is absolutely cataclysmic. 350, this is in the mountains alone, 350 billion tons a year. That's 10,000 tons per second on average. So you can see it in places like this. This is one of 5,000 glacial lakes that have been appearing across the Himalaya. And from time to time, they burst out, and often with very tragic consequences for the people who live beneath them, including in one village I visited that you can read about in the book. And then in Greenland, this is a man called Rasmus Christiansen who's out hunting. The men of his Inuit community, they would always go out hunting on the sea ice. Now the ice is disappearing progressively. And of course, the land ice, which covers 80% of Greenland's surface, is also shrinking. And it's that disappearance of the land ice and the mountain glaciers that has very serious consequences for people in low-lying coastal areas all over the world. In Venice, I was there to see the first operation of this extraordinary project. It's a multi-billion euro barrier that's been built to cut Venice off from the sea. And it's really the brainchild of a single man called Alberto Scotti, who's been working on it for half a lifetime, since the 1980s. And when we met for spaghetti in Verona, he was telling me that he has been so dismayed to see the years of corruption that have undermined his vision. But finally, he was there that day to see this come up. And now Venice is far better protected against the threat of the rising water. So this is the kind of technological advance that we can expect to see more of in the years to come to protect these low-lying cities. But when you consider the number of people who live in cities from New York to Miami, cities from Jakarta, all over the world, the amount of investment that's going to be required is phenomenal and intimidating. And this is in Bangladesh. This lady on the right is a lady called Morgina, came from the southwest of Bangladesh, where intruding salt water is destroying the rice farms that people have made their livelihoods from for many, many years. And increasingly, they're flocking in huge numbers to the slums of Dhaka. It's a huge crisis for Bangladesh. I want to focus in particular in this section on the Solomon Islands. So Solomon Islands is a country in the deepest South Pacific to the far east of Australia. And this is a man named Maso, an island called Nuatambu, which literally means forbidden island. So to get there, I spend several hours on a little boat heading over from the provincial capital of Taro. And Maso happened to be standing on the wharf when I arrived. And my companions and I asked if it was okay for us to stay and learn about what was happening to this island. So Maso said this would require formal approval from the community. He blew a huge conch shell to summon a meeting of the village. And the verdict, albeit not unanimous, was that I could stay. And what I learned there was the story of an island that has been literally divided in two by the rising ocean. The sea level has been rising much more quickly in the Solomon Islands than other parts of the world to do with changes in wind patterns. And so the point that he's standing at here actually used to be the center of his village. Then in the provincial capital called Taro, this is a picture I took with a drone. You can see it's also extremely low-lying, very, very threatened by the rising ocean. And the people of Taro, led in particular by this man, Isaac Lekalalu, are pursuing an extraordinary project to move the entire township to a different site on a larger island where they'll be safer from the water. But this comes down to one of the key questions for me. People like Maso, people like Isaac are doing everything they can to protect their communities against the impacts of climate change. But it costs money, especially the Taro project will cost many millions of dollars. It's money that they don't have. But these are costs that are being imposed on them by people from elsewhere in the world. These are not people with large carbon footprints. So the question is, how is this to be paid for? And the obvious solution, it seems to me, would be for the wealthy countries that have driven the lion's share of climate change to provide that assistance. But so far, they've been falling woefully short of that target. And this was a key subject of discussion at COP26 last year, or remains so at COP27, the climate summit this year. And it's important. And I think speaking to people in the Solomon Islands and many other parts of the world, it's something they're very, very keenly aware of. Now, for some people in this struggle, it is very literally a fight for survival. So this goes for people that I met in Ethiopia, where I met Afar pastoralist people who are really struggling to keep themselves alive, faced by the most extraordinarily harsh conditions, drought and locust infestations. But there's also people like Awapu and Tebu. So Awapu is on the left, and he is the leader of a group of indigenous tribal people in the Uru-Ewawao indigenous territory of Brazil. So the Uru-Ewawao are one of a large number of tribal peoples who live in the Brazilian Amazon. And until the 1980s, which is when Awapu was born, they lived totally separately from the outside world. They had no contact with anyone else. And they had a stable, safe, flourishing culture. And then modern Brazil brought them into contact. Very quickly, the majority of them died because they didn't have immunity against diseases. Others of them were actually murdered. And now it's getting worse. There are fewer than 100 of them left. And invaders are trying to take over the land, to burn down the forest, to create space for cattle ranching. That's the biggest driver of deforestation in the Amazon. The way to get rich. And I met people who are burning down the forests in the Amazon. They were very happy to speak to me, to be photographed, to tell their stories, because under the current president, Bolsonaro, a sense of total impunity has set in. So people are very happy to openly break the law, burn down the forest, and attack people like the Uru-Ewawao. So Awapu is the leader of a group, a sort of battalion of young resistance fighters who are trying to defend their territory against these invasions. A few months before we met, his fellow leader of that group and brother-in-law, Ari, was murdered by these people. And Awapu was visibly and openly worried that he could be next. He has a young child. He's concerned about it. But he believes that this is simply a fight for the future of his entire culture and civilization. And he's doing everything he can to move forward in that. And it's not just his own civilization that depends on this. People like Awapu, who are trying to defend the Amazon and all the other carbon sinks we have around the world, are doing an enormous service to the rest of us. If the Amazon is lost, the consequences for the whole of humanity will be terrible. It's already, as one of Brazil's leading climate scientists told me, approaching a tipping point where the shrinkage of the Amazon could take on a life of its own. So people like Awapu need our support, and they're doing us a great service. Now, on my journey around the world, I met many people who are pursuing various forms of technology to help tackle the extraordinary problems that we face. Because this is not just a book about the problems, it's also a book about potential solutions and the extraordinary people who are trying to move them forward. So this is Didier Toubiat. He's the chief executive of a company called Aleph Farms in Israel. And this is based upon the scientific research of a woman called Shulamit Levenberg, who I interviewed in her office in Haifa. And she's a cardiac medicine researcher. She found a way to grow human heart cells that could be used to treat cardiac patients. And then someone said to her, well, what if you did the same thing with cow cells to make steak? And initially she wasn't too keen. But then she started to think about the environmental implications, because cattle farming, as we've heard, it's a major driver of deforestation in the Amazon. It's also an enormous source of methane emissions, and the demand for meat is growing and growing and growing. So if you could grow meat in bioreactors, it might sound pretty spooky to many people, but it could actually be a dramatically more environmentally friendly way of providing the surging global demand for meat. This is He Xiaopeng. He's one of many fascinating Chinese entrepreneurs that I met. He was at his office in Guangzhou, and he made his billions in the Chinese internet sector. He was the creator of a very popular mobile browser that you might be familiar with called UC Web. But now he's realized, along with many other of the most prominent and talented Chinese entrepreneurs, that where the real wins are to be had is in clean tech. Because while it's true, as everyone knows, China is now the biggest source of carbon emissions, it's burning huge amounts of coal, that's absolutely true. But it's also growing tremendously fast in everything from electric cars to solar panels. And no one seriously disputes that for Xi Jinping in the long term, being an energy superpower in the clean energy era is absolutely at the center of that strategy. And in the US too, I met people who are pursuing extraordinary cutting edge scientific research. This is Bob Mumgard. He's the chief executive of Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is one of the leading fusion power, there are a whole bunch of fusion power startups all over the world. Fusion power has sort of been the stuff of science fiction for many years, and it would be this sort of mythological source of clean and safe and almost limitless clean power. But according to Bob Mumgard, as he told me when I visited him at his labs, he could be just a few years away from actually nailing it and starting to get something commercial on the market. Just a few months ago, he raised about $2 billion from people who actually seem to believe him. So to be kept an eye on. I'm not sure I would be quite as confident as him, but he assures me that he's on track. So let's see what happens. And this is another amazing startup that I visited. This woman's name is Edda Aradottir. This is up in Iceland. This is a plant, it's a joint venture between two companies. There's a couple of young German engineers who have figured out a way to suck carbon dioxide from the air using these sort of 2-meter cubed boxes. But the question is, what do you do with the carbon dioxide? Well, Iceland, as you might know, is full of volcanoes. It's created by volcanoes. And underneath all that volcanic rock is basalt, which can absorb carbon dioxide dissolved in water to form limestone. So that's what they're doing now. They're using the machines of Climeworks to suck the carbon dioxide from the air, turn it into soda water, pump it underground, and they're reversing the carbon cycle. Instead of taking underground rock and burning it and turning it into gas, you're taking that gas and turning it back into an inert underground solid. And And already they're selling carbon certificates. You can go on their website to buy them. Bill Gates has been buying them. Audi's been buying them. Microsoft's been buying them. And this could be part of how we tackle the problem. It's a controversial area. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be focusing on reducing the emissions, but at some point, sucking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we have too much of it there already. And I think that's probably going to be something we need to do at quite some scale. Now, I want to close with some stories from Congo. This was one of the most memorable parts of my trip, and I went there in particular to look at the cobalt mining industry. Why cobalt? Because cobalt is found in the vast majority of electric car batteries, and the vast majority of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the very poorest countries in the world. It doesn't have to be so poor. It's full of natural resources, but it is. So this mine, I actually went down inside one of these two mines that's owned by this woman called Monique Swila. She's a really sort of entrepreneurial, hard-chasing micro tycoon. That's a dollar sign, as maybe you can see on her necklace. And she's running these mines, and they're incredibly dangerous. There's absolutely no sort of health and safety standards. To get down there, I had to go down barefoot, sort of like a Victorian chimney sweep. And that was a pretty scary experience, just going down there for 15 minutes. I mean, you know, these mines do periodically collapse. But people like Gelord Selenge go down there all day, every day, and will do for the foreseeable future. This is the best work available to them. It can pay them a few dollars a day. And there are also children. So Letitia spent several years working on a mine site. She's now being helped by a charity. She's now an apprentice seamstress. But many, many children have been working on those sites, and it's a serious problem. And I think people have focused a lot on that child labor angle, which is perhaps the most shocking side of it. But it shouldn't blind us to the fact that there's a wider problem. Why are children going down mines in the first place? Why is anyone going down that sort of mine in the first place? Why should such a mine even exist? Why is that country so poor? It all comes down to spectacular corruption and mismanagement, not only for which we should blame not only the Congolese politicians themselves, but also the companies in Europe and North America and Asia who work with them hand in glove to propagate that system. And this is really something that came home to me very, very strongly during my travels. The climate crisis, now that we've all woken up to the scale of the physical threat that we face, we're questioning everything about the way the modern world operates, as we should. And it's an opportunity not only to build a global economy that has lower carbon emissions, it's also an opportunity to build a world that is fairer, more equitable, a world where children like Letitia would be in school right the way through their childhood. And I think in terms of what each of us can do, I have slight concern about the way the climate conversation goes. There's a lot of talk about what we can do as consumers in terms of eating less meat and flying less. And I do think these things are important. I do think they help if enough of us do them with enough enthusiasm. But I think even more important is what we can do as citizens in terms of contributing to the conversation, in terms of putting pressure on our leaders, both domestically and internationally. So that is where I'd like to leave it for now. I think it's something that was really brought home to me so powerfully during these travels. This is just a small sample of the stories in the book, but I hope that you might have a chance to read some of the others. And I think, do we have time for just a couple of questions? If there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes, gentleman there in the red shirt, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. When it comes to the conversation on climate change, what we are wanting for is clarity, right? So we do not know, are we consumers to take up responsibility for consuming less, consuming responsibly? Are we to pressure governments to tax corporations more? For the irony of climate change is that the impact is felt the most by people who contribute the least to it, right? And then there's a sense of helplessness of what impact can I individually make? You've presented some anecdotes, which are of course inspiring, but are they enough?
Yeah, I think we all have our own opinions on what needs to happen. So I can tell you my personal opinions. I think one of the key things we need is a serious price on carbon. I think at the moment, we don't have the incentives to act in a way that would be helpful for the climate. At the moment, it's far cheaper than it should be to fly, to do all these sorts of carbon intensive things. And the costs for that are being incurred not by the people conducting the activities, but by the people who are being hit by these serious impacts of climate change. I think carbon pricing is essential. I think it has to be international. So it's no good just one country imposing it if other countries don't follow suit, because that country's industry will just be wiped out. I don't have enough time to go into it here, but I think the best model I've seen is called the Carbon Club. It's a model developed by William Nordhaus, who's a Nobel winner in economics. And he develops this idea that if just a couple of big economies can start with a serious carbon pricing regime, let's say the US and the EU, they impose taxes or import duties on countries that are not part of the club, it can create an incentive for other countries to start falling in line. But the second part of this is that it has to be equitable. As you said, it's people who have had often the least responsibility for the crisis who have been facing some of the worst effects. So it's vitally important that this goes hand in hand with scaled up support for developing countries of an order of magnitude greater than anything that's currently being discussed, and also within countries. I think this will never get over the line politically in the Western democracies if lower income people feel that they're being hit too hard. Energy bills are a relatively high proportion of income for lower income people. So that's a really important part of it as well. Equity and a serious economic incentive to use less carbon. Those would be my two personal opinions. But I think it's really important that everyone should feel empowered to contribute their own ideas as well.
Yeah, hi. Hello. Yeah, I run a small club helping to save environment. So since you are a knowledgeable, well-traveled person, a simple question. Do you think taking out the fossil fuels and going into the electric cars and all these Teslas coming in out, do you think it might just spell a bigger disaster?
I'm sorry, moving to electric cars, moving away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, you've traveled to the mines, you've traveled to Congo and stuff. Do you think it might spell a bigger disaster coming in of electric cars and stuff?
Not a bigger disaster. No, I do think that the scale of this Russian roulette that we're playing with the climate is catastrophically dangerous. And I think however we get away from fossil fuels, if we avoid that catastrophe, that will be better than the alternative. But I think to resign ourselves to the new clean energy economy happening along the same unfair lines as the existing one would be the most extraordinary wasted opportunity and a real tragedy. So no, when I talk about the problems within the clean energy supply chain, this is by no means saying that we might be better off sticking with fossil fuels. I certainly don't think that. But I do think that reducing our emissions is only one part of the challenge facing us. And we have an incredible opportunity to go far better in terms of creating an economy that really works better for everyone in the world. I think we're about out of time, but thank you so much for listening. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Simon, for showing how each one of us can save the world. In fact, climate is a theme which has been coming up across sessions, including the one Abhijit Banerjee, the Nobel laureate, took only a few hours before you came in. So it's a very good way to be coming towards the close of this festival. Thank you very much. We thank Hero Future Energies for their support. This session was part of the Urgency of Borrowed Time series. I'd urge that please visit the Festival Bazaar and the Pool Bazaar, which empower small artisans, craftspeople, and young entrepreneurs in the handcrafted space and are teeming with textile, stationery, apparel, jewelry, footwear, lifestyle, home decor, and utilities. It's open till 6:30 p.m. Those of you who haven't been there, do go there. Those of you who went there and decided that you'll pick up something later, now's the time, otherwise it's gone. Thank you.
For governments and businesses alike.
Simon will be signing his
We are
books.
working to accelerate the global journey to net zero and contribute to a low carbon future for all.